I was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, forehead stinging from the cold, chest still heaving from shoveling when Brenda Morrison marched across the street like she owned the place, designer parka hard eyes, the sort of smile that pretends to be kind but is actually a measuring tape, and I thought, well, this is going to be a morning. I had been out there since 6 clearing 2 feet of snow so I could get to work, and the last thing I needed was someone policing where I piled snow on my own lawn. "Excuse me, Robert Daniels," she shouted, voice cutting through the quiet like a saw. "What do you think you're doing?" I leaned on my shovel because my back hurt and because the scene felt like a bad sitcom, and I said plain and slow, "Shoveling snow, Brenda, same thing everyone's doing." She pointed at the neat mounds on my yard, the snow I had carefully heaped away from the sidewalk, and informed me as if reciting scripture that it was unsightly and against HOA regulations. Then she lifted her phone and started taking pictures like I was vandalizing a monument. I laughed because sometimes you laugh at stuff that is too absurd to get mad about properly, and I said, "You're calling the cops because I shoveled my driveway." "Yes," she said with full theatrical authority, "I will." 20 minutes later, a Sterling Heights cruiser rolled up, an officer got out, looked at the scene, the snow, my house, Brenda, peeking through her curtains, and did what any sane person would do. He told her, "HOA disputes are civil matters, and that shoveling snow on your own property is not a crime." He left, and I went inside thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next week, the HOA sent me violation letters, each one turning up the pressure, $50 a day, then $100, then a mandatory hearing. The language in those letters felt designed to make a person feel small. And for the first time, this neighborhood started to feel less like where people lived and more like a place where someone kept score. I had been paying my dues mowing my lawn, keeping my head down since I moved here 2 years earlier. But this felt personal, petty and wrong, and there was this little voice in my head telling me to stop ignoring the itch. The night before the hearing, I dug through the file box of paperwork from when I bought the house, deed surveys, county records I had mostly skimmed and filed away, and I started looking closer because sometimes the thing under the carpet is a loose nail. What I found was the kind of clerical mess you'd expect when a development goes belly up. The original developer had gone bankrupt, mid-build parcels got shuffled in the sale, and somehow Oakwood Drive, the stretch of private road that ran in front of my house and past Brenda's, ended up recorded with my parcel. I called Michael Chen, the real estate attorney who had helped me buy the place, and 2 hours later he called back with a laugh in his voice. "You're right, you own the street." I remember the feeling, a mix of disbelief and this weird, warm satisfaction, like finding an extra fry under the napkin. And suddenly the petty harassment had leverage, which doesn't make you noble, but it makes you less afraid. At the HOA hearing, Brenda sat at the front like a prosecuting attorney, flanked by 2 board members who always seemed ready to nod. She read the complaint, "Unsightly snow piles," and watched the room for reaction. The meeting smelled faintly of coffee and fluorescent lights and someone else's sense of entitlement. Michael spoke calmly, and he tore the covenant language apart, vague phrases, subjective standards, and he pointed out that fines like the ones they proposed would not hold up. Then I stood, put the county recorded deeds on the table, and said, "I own Oakwood Drive," and the room went still. You could watch realization crawl across Brenda's face, confusion, then fear, then anger, the kind of anger that comes when the power you wield is suddenly under scrutiny, and the implications hit the rest of the homeowners, half of whom accessed their properties via that road. I could have been vindictive. I could have threatened to gate the road and watch the neighborhood scramble, but I wasn't interested in being a petty ruler. I wanted to be left alone, so I offered an easement recorded access for current residents free of charge if they dropped the fines, dismissed the violation, and stopped the harassment. They huddled, whispered, looked like folks who'd been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. And when they came back, the board table felt smaller. They agreed to dismiss the violation. For now, Brenda muttered something close to an apology, grudging and clipped, and I asked for it in writing. That should have ended it, but of course it didn't, because when someone's been bluffing, they sometimes double down instead of folding. 2 weeks later, the HOA's lawyer sent me a letter demanding I quit claim the street or face a lawsuit. I forwarded it to Michael. He said they were bluffing. The deed was solid. We sent a calm response with facts, and then the HOA shifted tones, trying to argue an implied easement through long-term use. The back and forth stretched for months, and while all that legal chewing was happening, I started poking where it felt wrong at the HOA finances. Because everywhere there is petty power, there is often a paper trail, a trail that likes to hide. What I found was ugly payments to a Morrison property management account, invoices that were vague, charges that didn't match services, landscaping expenses routed to Brenda's address, a computer delivered to her house, travel charges that didn't line up with any legitimate HOA conference, and the management company appeared to be owned by Brenda's husband, Donald. I took those photocopies and talked to neighbors, many of whom shrugged at first because they had better things to do than dig into budgets. But when I laid it out, months of payments, duplicates for the same work, personal-looking expenses, people got quiet and then interested, and interest turned into action when the bylaws allowed any homeowner to call a special meeting with enough signatures. I went door to door and got the petition signed. The special meeting was called, the clubhouse filled, and I put the numbers up on a projector describing nearly $45,000 paid over 3 years with little documentation. And I watched the room change, humor turning to outrage, whispers turning to, "Is this true?" The board couldn't stonewall forever. They agreed to hire an independent auditor, and the auditor's report was brutal about $32,000 of questionable expenses, duplication of payments, and things that looked a lot like self-dealing. The recommendation was to refer the matter to law enforcement. Neighbors who had never laughed together before were suddenly sharing casseroles and gossip. The community that used to be a collection of fearful homeowners started talking, and that talk became action. The HOA apologized publicly, reimbursed my legal fees. Brenda resigned. Detectives interviewed her and Donald, and the scoreboard finally started to tilt toward justice. Brenda and Donald eventually pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud. The court ordered restitution, probation, and a sentence that was measured but real. I won't pretend I celebrated like it was a parade. There's a human cost even when someone is guilty, but I felt relief. Relief that the system could work when people did their jobs, when evidence mattered more than ego. We recorded proper easements for Oakwood Drive, so access was forever clear. The HOA cut out the fake management fees and lowered dues. The new board actually cared about the neighborhood. We had block parties and potlucks. Patricia Hughes became president and did the job with decency, and life slowly got back to ordinary. The lessons came slow and stuck. Read your deeds, for God's sake. Someone else's signature on paper can change everything. Stand up to petty tyranny, because giving in once makes you an easier target the next time. And most people honestly are reasonable if you give them a chance. There was quiet closure in the small things one winter. I shoveled my driveway, piled snow on my lawn, the exact way I'd always done. No photos, no calls. Tom from across the Morrison house came by with his shovel and waved. We talked about easement paperwork and kids playing in the street. Someone thanked me in a way that made me feel embarrassed and proud at the same time. When Brenda reported to prison, I planted flowers that afternoon, and the neighborhood that had been cowed for years became one where people looked out for each other, a neighborhood watch that wasn't about spying, but about helping clean up days, and real meetings that fixed real problems instead of inventing new ones. And yes, owning the street was a twist I hadn't asked for, but it turned out to be less about power and more about responsibility, the boring, tedious stuff like stamps, recorded easements, persistent follow-up paperwork that in the end kept everyone safe from future games. So here's the question I want to throw at you, because you didn't come here for a story about snow alone. When do you tolerate small wrongs, and when do you call them out? Is it worth making trouble for the chance you might uncover something worse? Have you ever stood up and wished you hadn't, or wished you had? Tell me, because stories like this don't change anything until someone else hears them and decides not to be the easy target. Tomorrow morning the snow will fall again, and I'll shovel it the way I always have and pile it where I please, and mostly what that means now is this: we get to live on our own property without someone breathing down our necks, and sometimes one stubborn no at a time, a whole neighborhood remembers how to be a community.